Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to Asia Society. I'm Richard Holbrook, and I'm the chairman of this organization. Vishaka Desai is in Seoul today on a women's leadership forum, and I'm delighted to welcome you here. And before I introduce Senator Hagel, I want to make a naked plea that if you're not members of the Asia Society, if you've just come here because you want to hear Senator Hagel, which is a great idea, we have many other terrific events, and I hope you will join. There's a membership card here. Our current exhibitions, both of which are reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Arts section, you can visit them on the way down. The fantastic one is the one on the Chinese Cultural Revolution art, the first ever. And you may have noticed Headless Mao sitting on Park Avenue there. Would have startled an earlier generation of Park Avenue residents. But we're very proud of this exhibition and of our museum staff. We have a very active policy program, and this is part of that. Senator Hagel joins a long line of distinguished public figures who've talked here, presidents, secretaries of state, presidential candidates, and today, Chuck Hagel. He is the senior senator from Nebraska, serving his second term to universal regret, and I speak as a Democrat. He has announced that he announced that he would not run for re-election at the end of this year, but that certainly is not the end of his service to the nation. He is on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and has recently just returned in the last week from a trip to East Asia. And of course he went with Senator Obama on the highly heralded trip to Iraq and Afghanistan earlier this year. I've known Chuck Hagel ever since he entered the Senate. He has been a friend of mine, and I treasure that friendship, and an extraordinarily important person in a Senate in a very divisive and polarized era, a man who continued to work for the principles of bipartisanship and the national interest, which were increasingly rare in the last decade in Washington. And I am just delighted that he has continued that role in recent months and years. Our format today is very simple. Senator Hagel will speak about his trip. Then he will sit down with the ever-dangerous major political commentator, columnist, and in my view the best political journalist in this nation, Joe Klein, and they will have a conversation in which all things are allowed. But remember, as Talleyrand said, there are no indiscreet questions, there are only indiscreet answers, so we can be guided by that. So Chuck, thank you so much for coming to New York today. I've wanted you to be here ever since I became chairman. It took a lot of work. Thank you to your schedule for joining us today. It couldn't be more timely, 11 days to go. I give you all, ladies and gentlemen, the senior senator for Nebraska, Chuck Hagel.
Thank you very much. Richard, thank you. As usual, you were full of hyperbole, exaggeration, but that's one of your more endearing qualities. Just ask Kati. Thank you. I am always grateful for an opportunity to be with people who care about America, the learned, as opposed to others who don't like to be with those who don't understand or don't support America. You probably have noted some of that in the campaign trail, as we are now dividing up the country between those who love America and those who don't love America. But I know you love America, so I'm damn glad to be with people who love America. So thank you. Thanks also to what the Asia Society does for our world, because everyone here in this room and those who had the foresight and the energy to establish this institution long ago understood that we are global citizens. And that certainly does not devalue the citizenship of our sovereign nations, and we love our countries. But the fact is we live in a global community underpinned by a global economy. And the Asia Society was one of the first institutions in this country, as well as the world, to really understand that and connect that. That has served us very well over the years, particularly at this time when we all understand the importance of Asia. And I'd like to reflect on Asia and our relationship, where we are in the world today, drawing somewhat from the recent trip that I have returned from, which Richard mentioned, where I was in China and Japan and South Korea for about 8 days, spent a couple of days in each of those countries, met with the leaders of those countries. And as is always the case, you all understand this, that when you have an opportunity to be out and observe and listen, that hopefully gives you a more significant frame of reference to analyze and make some judgments, especially at this historic time in the world. And I say historic not just because of essentially an unprecedented financial crisis that we are in, and I might add global financial crisis, as everyone in this room knows. But I would even go beyond that and say that we are living, in my opinion, at maybe the most transformational time in the history of man. We are seeing a diffusion of power, a diffusion of economic geopolitical power at a rate we've never ever experienced in mankind's history. When you analyze this and you break it down into regions or industries or compartments, you start to see in a very clear way all the confluences that are now coming together to direct this great global reorientation. And it's interesting because it is also coming at a time when we are changing global leadership, not just here in the United States, as we all know, and as Richard has noted, and in about a week and a half we will elect a new president. Now, that new president, who will take office in January, but in effect will take office November 5th, because of the immediate demands and the depth of our problems, will be assigned to that new president hours after he's elected. We're not going to all wait till Inauguration Day on January 20th, and that became very clear when I was in China and Japan and South Korea last week, when the presidents and the prime ministers and the heads of the central banks and finance ministers, defense ministers all asked me, well, what's McCain going to do, or what's Obama going to do? What is their plan? Who are their people? What's their vision? We're all in trouble. You helped get us there, America. So what are you going to do to get us out? And that also is a reminder, but the larger theme, the larger format, the larger arc of this global dynamic, this 6.5 billion people community that we are part of, is moving in directions we've never ever seen it move before. And this diffusion of economic power, I mean, just isolate for a moment on the Persian Gulf, on how energy is driving so much of this. The great emerging economies of Asia, which represent the largest emerging economies of the world, the largest populations, nuclear powers, conflict. All of that now is in play in a way that we've never seen anything quite like this. That also represents more uncontrollables that we're dealing with than ever before. I believe the next president will inherit the largest inventory of challenges that any president has inherited since Franklin Roosevelt's first term, in 1933. And I think in many cases maybe it will be more severe, because these are now global challenges. These are now interconnected, woven into one fabric. There's far less margin of error. The immediacy of the threats are unlike anything we've ever seen before. And again, less controllables. And it is not just a matter of, well, the Congress will get together. We had a banking committee hearing yesterday for 5 hours. Some of you may have seen some of that. It's been reported in all the newspapers today. What are we doing about this $700 billion? How are we getting the money out? What are we doing to start to, hopefully, inject some new confidence in the markets, thereby seeing that we would get credit and liquidity loosened up, and all the things that ripple across economies. We all know markets work off of confidence. Well, people work off of confidence. Nations work from that perspective. And when the world loses confidence in America, which has happened, that's what's happened, just as if you reflect on what's happened politically in America, the American people have lost confidence in its leaders. They've lost confidence in its government. You don't need to go much beyond the latest Gallup poll numbers. Congress resides at a very impressive 12% now in job approval. And I was just with Jim Clifton, who is the head of Gallup. By the way, many of you may know that Gallup is a Nebraska firm. And just as an aside, I know it's a cheap parochial comment, but nonetheless, I pay particular attention to those Gallup numbers. Now, 12% job approval is probably too high, actually, for us, but nonetheless, it's not a particularly distinguished number. The president's numbers have been bouncing around in the 20s, and it depends on the day, but latest Gallup numbers that I saw this week were about 22, 23%. That's a sustained low. You look at political parties, our government, any institutions, Wall Street, now that their numbers are looking well with American people. They've lost confidence in their institutions, the American people, in their leaders, in their politics. And after all, politics just reflects society. We don't lead in politics. We respond. We react. And when things aren't going well or they're going easy or status quo, you look at a Congress, you look at a president, that's what you see. You will see your congressional leadership of your states and of America, and most of the times in a cabinet, they will respond to the times. And so we have a breakdown in confidence and trust. We have a breakdown in confidence and trust in American leadership worldwide. That's what's happened to markets. Now, I know it's a lot more complicated than just that. I get that. I've been on the banking committee 12 years and had some sense of this, and I was the one, incidentally, who had continued to keep putting forward Fannie and Freddie Mac bills to regulate Fannie and Freddie, warning in those hearings over the years that this was going to come. Not that I'm any smarter than anybody else, but some of us were paying attention. But it all comes together at this historic transformational time in the world. Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, all of Asia represents, as much as any other part of the world, a new center of gravity. You take trade, you take emerging economies, political power, numbers, nuclear powers. You take any measurement, any component of those metrics, and it resides right there in Asia. Now, I am not one who has ever argued in response to those who question our transatlantic alliance or NATO that we should throw overboard our relationship with our European friends in any way. I don't believe that. I think that should not be the choice. I think that's a false choice. In fact, I think the transatlantic alliance, that relationship, still represents the most stable and important relationship in the world today, because it is the only cohesive relationship that is structured around very clear common interests. But this relationship with Asia, that we are emerging into a closer and deeper relationship, if no other reason than the Asians control half of our government because they own more than half of our debt. And that's a pretty good place to start, and I think everybody understands that. But this relationship has to get tied together in a very cohesive way that we're still not there. We're still floundering, and we're still bumping around into each other. The American-Chinese relationship, that bilateral relationship between the United States and China, is as critical to the future of mankind as any bilateral relationship in this century. This has to get right. This is a complicated relationship. You all know that. Many of you are far more adept and experienced and knowledgeable about this relationship than I am. It is a relationship of competition, but it's also a relationship of cooperation. And it can be the relationship we want it to be. And we can veer way off course on this relationship, just as we can with Russia. That's the other part of this, too, that we've got to get a relationship with Russia fixed here, because those two countries are so critically important to all of us. Common interests. And I go back occasionally to the 50s, when Eisenhower and so many of our great leaders that came out of World War II brought the world through World War II. Great leaders around the world, not just American leaders, but our allies, produced and built for the very reasons I just noted, and you all know this, common interests. They built coalitions of common interests because they understood there could not be. The world was too dangerous now to be anywhere near some concept of zero-sum games. You win, we lose. Can't be that way. We should, for example, embrace the rise of China and Russia and Brazil and all these emerging economies. Dangerous some of them are, yes. We have to watch what's going on. We have to be part of that. We have to use influences. But if for no other reason, as these economies emerge, we break down old hostilities. Standards of living increase for the people, not everybody. I mean, obviously, China's sitting out there with 800 million abject poverty citizens. They still have a middle class far larger than America's entire country. You build on relationships based on common interests. You build on relationships not on differences. You define your relationships not on differences. You define your relationships on common interests. Iran's another good example. You can't just let Iran drift and drift and drift and say, well, if we want to talk with them, they then are going to have to fulfill unconditional capacities and our demands in order to sit at the table with us. That ain't going to work. And we've been so successful with all of this, with our current policy. The world's far too dangerous for this. And if we don't have these coalitions of common interest for the 21st century, relevant to the 21st century, like they were built in the 50s, relevant to the 20th century challenges, NATO, United Nations, Bretton Woods, 1944 brought the IMF, World Bank, multilateral banks, development, general agreement on tariffs and trade, now the WTO. All imperfect, all problems. They can't all fix the problems of the world, of course not. But their boundaries, their behavioral structures, their arcs of participation, where you don't push people out, you include people. And you force people into some boundaries of standards of behavior. Now, do people cheat? Yes. Do they lie? Yes. Do they not comply with these standards? Yes. But guess what? So do Americans. I mean, if we didn't need to have laws because everybody played by the rules, there'd be a wonderful world. But even if we have laws, as we do have a lot of laws, there are still murders. There's still people going to jail for cheating their clients. Now, our responsibility is to make a better world. That's our responsibility, make a better world. Take all of what you have, understand the reality of that, frame it all up in a 21st century way, and that's the essence of what the next president is going to have to do. And the next president is going to have, I think, a rare capacity, a rare opportunity to do that. He is going to inherit a bundle of trouble. But within all that, he has an opportunity to do some things unlike any president has had the opportunity to do since Franklin Roosevelt's first 4 years. Asia has to be part of that. And I believe they will be. I'm optimistic about this because democracies work. Our system of government does work. All the countervailing pressures on people and dynamics and debate, they work. I will end with this. The next president, in order to fulfill the commitment and the expectations the world has for the next president, and what Americans have and should have for their leadership, is going to rely on one very fundamental thing. And that is, can the next president, the day that he takes office, but even before that, the day he's elected, can he reach out to this country and form a consensus of bipartisanship to govern this country? He's going to have to immediately reach to the Congress to form a bipartisan consensus to govern, and the American people. That doesn't mean we're not going to have differences. We should have differences. We should have differences. But we've got to get out of the grip of the raw partisan political paralysis that's just sunk us down into a bog where we can't move. It is dangerous, and we can't let this country drift for another 4 years. And whether this next president can accomplish that or not is going to depend on the future of our country, the future of our country. And the rest of the world is watching. I think the rest of the world wants to follow an America that will lead with our allies, as we have done effectively in most cases since World War II. They don't want America to impose its will, to dictate. They don't want America to invade and occupy. They want us to lead with coalitions, with alliances, coalitions of common interest, based on those same common interests that we all have. And we are now integrated into a global social, economic, security fabric. I think the next president can do that. He's going to have to reach to the Congress, the American people. Every challenge we face today, every challenge Asia faces, every challenge South America faces — I was just in South America a month ago, in Brazil and Colombia and Panama — is a global challenge. And you name them. Let's start with proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I'd say that's a pretty significant challenge for the world. That's not just a challenge for Americans. We're not the only ones concerned about a nuclear missile coming into New York, or a dirty bomb into Chicago. How about the environment? How about pandemic health issues, energy, despair? I think all those are pretty global. Terrorism, I think that'd be rated pretty high, wouldn't it? Extremism, people using religion and using other means to find a way to their own evil end. And who do those people prey on most? It's the 40% of the world's citizenry that is locked in abject poverty. That's who they prey on. And I'm not one who necessarily connects poverty to terrorism. Osama bin Laden disproves that. But when those people of the world, and right now we are looking at that human condition as one of the greatest challenges we all face. And if we don't address those human challenges and those human conditions, then it will get to a point, if we're not almost there now, where armies won't make a difference. You can't field enough Marines and Army. You can't field enough of good economies to turn this around. And that's also a big part of this relationship. Well, I've not said anything profound. I'm incapable of that. Nor have I said anything you don't know already. But I think occasionally it's good to just reflect on some of these issues. I'm hopeful. I believe in our country. I believe in our democracy. I think most of the world is, in a very good sense, a very real sense, made up of people who do care about their children. And no one's got a corner on that. We have to remind ourselves occasionally. I don't think Christians care about their children more than Jews do, or Muslims do, or Buddhists do. I've never seen that. Maybe some of you have seen that. I don't think there's a chosen people in the world. Tolerance is going to be about as important as any one thing as we prepare our next generation to inherit these things. We don't have any choice, or we'll blow up the world. I mean, we will ruin mankind if we don't get this turned around, and we will. Well, thank you for an opportunity to share some thoughts, and now the real master of the universe, Joe Klein, is going to join us here on stage. Joe Klein, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I have some housekeeping here. I'd like to welcome everyone who's tuning in from around the world to watch the live webcast of this event on our website, www.asiasociety.org, and I hope your computers are faster than mine so that you're not getting this in bits and starts. Online viewers can email questions to Senator Hagel to moderator, that would be me, at asiasociety.org. Now, oh, yes. Also, after we're done here, Senator Hagel will be signing copies of his new book, America, the Next Chapter, in the room back there. And as a fellow author, I would say to you, go and buy and support.
Thank you.
I have a confession to make. Chuck Hagel is one of my favorite senators. In the 90s, I became really close and attached to the group of U.S. senators who were former combat vets, especially of my era, of Vietnam, because they had seen the reality of what government can do when it screws up. They have seen the power of the United States in a way that most other people my age, or baby boomers, hadn't seen. I especially like the ones from Nebraska. And the thing that I loved the most about them was that when you asked them a question, they'd actually answer it. So with that in mind...
He's talking about Bob Kerrey.
So with that in mind, let me start off by asking you about that trip you took with Senator Obama. You are in a unique position here. You know the three knowable candidates for high office, unless you've spent a lot of time in Alaska. I don't know whether you have much expertise about the fourth. You know John McCain very well. Your office is across the hall from his, right?
Yes.
You've traveled the world with Joe Biden. You went to Iraq with Barack Obama. He's the one that I'm most interested in at this point. I imagine most people here are too. What can you tell us about him and about that trip that might surprise us?
Well, thank you, Joe. I appreciate very much you taking time today to spend with us, and at some risk of violating every responsible boundary between practicing journalists and politicians, I too confess that I'm an admirer and an avid reader of Klein's columns and books. But I'm leaving politics, so the hell with it. I won't worry about it. Mr. Obama, I would also, as you have noted, say that I have great affection for Senators McCain and Biden, who I've known very, very well over the years, very close to both of them. And all three of those men, and you're right, I don't know Governor Palin, so I'm not equipped to judge.
Neither did John McCain at that time.
On any basis, I don't know her. So those three men that you've asked me about, in particular Senator Obama, are very, very unique individuals, and for a lot of different reasons. But actually, it comes down to one point that each, I think, share that is a common denominator for unique people who are really special people who spent a long time and much of their lives contributing to their country and to the betterment of society. And that is that they are as courageous as any people I've ever known. And they are courageous about believing in themselves, believing in what they are doing and their efforts and the ability to really change things. Obama is, I think everyone who has watched him knows this, is as gifted and complete a politician as I've ever seen. I don't know in my lifetime, I've never seen anyone with the gifts that he has that represent one package. Now, that doesn't mean he'd be a good president, doesn't mean he wouldn't be. But that's where I start. I think also another thing the three of them have in common, and I don't profess to know Senator Obama that well, I know him pretty well, is that all three are very decent men. They're very decent men. And they all possess character. And one of the things I've observed about Obama and spending 4 years with him on the Foreign Relations Committee and then traveling around the world with him is he possesses what I've seen a rather significant and important judgment that I think is one of the indispensable requisites of leadership. Good judgment. You can excuse away experience bases because we're all products of our own experiences and our own past environments, but you can never excuse away good judgment. I mean, that is as defining a characteristic of an important leader, and I think a president. I think he has that. I've seen that in him. Another thing about the three of them, and focus again on Obama, is a sense of humor. And I think that's pretty important in anything, but sure as hell now it is. He's got a very, very good sense of humor. And when you have a good sense of humor, that means you don't take yourself too seriously. And all three of these guys are that way. They don't. They're tough. They're smart. They do not have fragile egos. And Obama's is as big as anybody's. But it's how you keep it in check. It's how you balance it, which is particularly important. So I would say that all three of them are friends, and I'm particularly pleased that one of my friends will be the next president.
Let me just push a little bit on Obama and on the toughness part. You've seen him in action in small rooms and in committee hearings. How tough a questioner is he? And is he as curious as you'd want your next president to be?
Obama's as curious as anybody I've ever been around. I'll give us an example. Give an example. As I've watched him for 4 years, when Obama came on the Foreign Relations Committee, he was at the end of the dais, which all freshmen usually wind up at the end because you're the least senior, so you're there. That means that you have to wait your turn after the committee takes the testimony of the witnesses before you are offered an opportunity to ask questions. Now, most senators will just get up and leave for a while, and then they'll come back when it's their turn to ask a question. He never did that. He would sit through the entire hearing, literally the hearing, before they would get to him because he was the last one to ask a question. And he would actually study it. He would actually listen. And then in the end, he had staff like we all do, and we all rely on our staff. But if you watch this carefully, and many of you in this room know this, members of Congress will often take a sheet of paper given to them by their staff, and their staff has written the question for them, so that makes us look smart, and it keeps us propped up. And so you read your question, or you act like you're not reading it, but it's not your question, it's your staff's. I've never seen him ask a question that was given to him by anybody. And his ability then to engage and then take the witness down 2 or 3 levels in the questioning, and the curiosity that is always evidence in that. In the meetings I was in, we were in 4 countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait, and Jordan. And in those small meetings with all the leaders of the countries and military and economic, the interest and the depth of the interest that he showed was pretty clear.
Well, let me ask you a Sunday morning talk show question. It's the obvious one. You haven't endorsed anybody yet. Your wife has endorsed Obama. I kind of got the hint that I know from what you've said before that I know the answer is to this. But you want to make some news?
Well, I would just like to again publicly acclaim how proud I am of my wife, and I am very proud of her. And actually, she was an early Obama supporter, and she was giving money to Obama before he had the primary locked up. But
has she threatened you in any way, shape, or form?
no, I'm a has-been, and I have said that she handles all political endorsements in our family now since I'm out of politics. And but let me explain, Joe. First, as we've already covered this ground, John McCain is an old friend and a good friend. And you may remember that I was co-chairman of his 2000 presidential campaign. And I just thought it was wiser to stay out of the political part of this. I have talked to John many times. Our relationship is still strong. I have told Obama and McCain both, and they both call me. I will give them my best advice as their candidates. I'll give them my best advice when one of them wins. And I think at this point, I mean, who knows how this is going to turn out with about 11 days before an election. But the trend lines appear pretty good for Obama. That doesn't mean he gets elected. But I'm not sure what I would bring to it anyway. I don't think the American people are on the edge of their chairs waiting for my endorsement. And I don't.
But all these people are.
Yeah. And I don't think I would swing that election one way or the other. But I have great admiration for all of them, and whoever wins, I'll help in any way I can.
Well, that takes away one other question. I just did an interview with Obama where he said very clearly that his top priority when he got to Washington domestically would be to create an alternative energy economy. He said he was pretty candid about this. He said the last 20 years had been run on cheap credit, had turbocharged the economy, and we needed to find a new turbocharger. Well, there are a lot of components to that, and one of them is the notion of climate change. I asked him if he was going to step back from his commitment to climate change because of the economic consequences of higher energy prices, and he refused to do that. Now, you were one of the leading opponents to the Kyoto Treaty. Have you, over the last 7 or 8 years, changed your mind about that? How do you think we should proceed with that?
Well, first, just to reflect on Kyoto, you might recall that there was a resolution passed in August of 1997. It was referred to as the Byrd-Hagel resolution, and it put the United States Senate on record on the Kyoto Treaty. It passed 95-0, 95-0, that the United States Senate would not vote for any climate change treaty that did economic harm to the United States or did not include in some way, not that everybody's standards had to be the same, but all nations. China is now the largest emitter of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. I have always felt that if we were going to be serious about this, then everyone was going to have to do something in a different way. But how in the world were we going to be able to deal with man-made greenhouse gas emissions when we disallowed the largest emerging economies, which are the largest emitters of greenhouse gases? If you didn't ask them to participate in some way, it made no sense to me, nor did it to 94 other senators, I might add. And interestingly enough, President Clinton never submitted that treaty, which I was there in Kyoto, and they flew Vice President Gore in to sign it, but yet they never submitted it to the United States Senate. Now, a lot of political nonsense has been talked about on this, but that's the fact, and that's the reality. Now, let's move forward to your question about where am I today. In the spring of 2001, I was asked to come to the White House under the new president and his cabinet and present my thoughts on what the the new president and his administration should do about climate change. And as you all, I'm sure, recall, President, or then Governor Bush, later President-elect Bush, campaigned against Kyoto. I mean, he was very clear about that. So we find a new president, a new administration. They asked me to come down, and in an hour presentation to most of the cabinet, by the way, the president was not there, but most of the cabinet was there. What I said was this: Kyoto's dead with the United States Senate. We know that. When you get a 95-0 vote, that's pretty clear. And what I said is that you're going to have to deal with this, and it's irresponsible not to deal with it. It is a reality. Our allies believe it's a reality. I mean, if you look at the United Nations efforts here over the years on this, Richard Holbrooke, who I admire greatly for his public service to this country in many, many capacities, was, as you all know, our United Nations ambassador. He and I talked about this many times. There was an expectation for America, the greatest economy, biggest economy, and the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. What are you all going to do? If you didn't like Kyoto, then put something forward. What I recommended is the Bush administration put something on the table. Coalesce, bring some accommodation to this issue, and start working towards some endpoint here to find a way where we could agree to deal with this issue of climate change. Well, this administration preferred not to do that. Later on, and the record's pretty clear on this, I am the one who introduced legislation. I am the one that had introduced legislation passed that is in current law. For example, the Energy Act of 2005-2006. Those environmental sections in that bill, now law, are my bills that I was able to get Senator Pryor from Arkansas to co-sponsor, and we were able to get a strong bipartisan support for them to start pushing this administration toward recognizing what we have to do. So certainly there is climate change. Certainly there is global warming. I mean, I think that's a pretty accepted premise. The question is, then what do you do about it? And that's where we fail.
And on the larger point of whether or not an alternative energy economy is something that can reinvigorate the economy, is that just wishful thinking?
No, I think Obama's exactly right. Cheap oil. There's no question that cheap oil has, as Barack says, turbocharged our economy for more than 20 years.
No, he's saying cheap credit.
And I thought he was talking about about climate change.
No, he said you were going to have to.
Oh, well, the credit too, but
yeah.
but cheap oil. That he didn't say cheap oil. I said that. Yeah. But to get to your point about alternative fuels in an economy that is going to require a new turbocharge. I believe that's what he said. He's right on that, and it is realistic because we're not going to have any choice. I don't have to remind anyone who's listening to this or watching this where we are with fossil fuels in the world today. I mean, obviously the run-up to oil has changed consumer patterns. Now it's back down to, what is it, $66 a barrel, whatever it is. OPEC's made a decision to cut their production. We now have Russia and Iran and Qatar talking about a natural gas consortium that maybe to do some things. We don't have any choice, not just for the environment, but for the economy, and he's right on this, is that all these things are coming to this convergence that's going to require to use our brains, our technology, our innovation to come up with a better way to do this.
I'm going to ask one more question, then turn it open to you folks. I expect you have a few. The biggest foreign policy challenge that Obama is going to face, at least this is the way that he has described it, is the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In the interview that we did, he said, I asked him whether he would talk to the Taliban, and he said that he would. What do you think the solution is there, in 25 words or less?
Well, I'll try to make that mark, but I am a senator, you know, Joe, and we have ramble, but. Well, I subscribe to that. I mean, I was talking about us engaging Iran before Barack was elected to the Senate. And we don't have any choice on these things. we'll just blow up the world. I mean, if that's because there's only one alternative where this is going. When you waltz yourself into a diplomatic cul-de-sac and you can't get out, where do you think this is going to go? Confrontation, conflict. There's no other way out of this. So, on the Taliban engagement, obviously these things have to be done right, structured right. I mean, so much nonsense in this campaign about Barack Obama would sit down with Ahmadinejad in no conditions. And he's never said that. That's not the way you do it. We've got a lot of experienced diplomats here, starting with Holbrooke. I mean, you set these things up the right way. But you do have to engage. Eisenhower engaged, Reagan engaged, Kennedy engaged, our greatest presidents have. But the Taliban, Petraeus has talked about this, General Petraeus, Gates has talked about this. These are military people who've talked about it. So yes, I think he's on the right track. But it's larger than that. You ask what you do about it. I think that the next president is going to have to frame a new strategic framework, a new strategic concept, a new strategic policy that includes the belt of countries ranging right straight across Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. You're not going to find any resolution, in my opinion, to Afghanistan, to Central Asia, to the bigger issue of extremism and terrorism in the world until you factor in the common interests of those four countries. All are connected to this. Obviously, Pakistan is the biggest one. Gates has said, I've said, others have said, Pakistan is the most dangerous country in the world today for all the obvious reasons. The future of Afghanistan is directly connected to the future of Pakistan. So if that's the case, I believe it is, that then you're going to have to widen your framework and widen your lens on strategic thinking, which then has to then be connected to a strategic policy. And that's what's going to have to occur.
Last question on a small but very important point. Over the summer, we changed our policy toward the border, the Pakistan border, or non-border, as it were. Our troops began to chase people who had attacked us across that border and make some cross-border raids as well. You think that's a good idea?
Well, I don't think it's just as stark as black and white as a good idea or a bad idea. There's a downside and upside to that. Downside is, as the Pakistani government and leaders have said, we're not going to allow our sovereignty to be violated anytime the Americans decide to chase somebody across the border. That's a real issue. That's a problem. At the same time, we also know the reality of what's going on. We know that Al-Qaeda, Taliban, use those mountains and use that ungovernable area of Pakistan, which has always been ungovernable, to retreat into, stage the raids. They're reconstituting their efforts there. They're restructuring there. They're retraining there, and rehabilitating there. So that's a reality. So we've got to find that's just why I say, Joe, in response to your last question, we've got to find a strategic framework that incorporates the interest of all four of those countries. You can't leave any of those four countries out, because it's questions like this that are going to have to be dealt with. And the answer to me is not, well, just keep chasing them into the mountain range. I mean, that's going to further destabilize Pakistan. And then we've really got a mess. If that government of Zardaris goes down, which it might, Pakistan is essentially bankrupt. I mean, you know, they're engaged with the IMF right now. China turned them down last week on helping them with a loan. I mean, these are all realities that factor right into our future and the future of Afghanistan. And the other problem that we've got, along with all these others, there are no governable institutions in Afghanistan, never have been. It's a totally tribal country, corruption and drugs. And until you start to address with a cogent policy those three issues, which we have not done in 7 years, then it isn't going to get any better. And you can't keep putting more troops in, because we'll just have a reverse of what we had in Iraq. And then you might even run the risk of a Vietnam here.
Well, on that happy note, if you follow two rules, please. One, identify yourself, and two, actually ask a question. We only have one senator in the room today. Yes.
Thank you. Professor Carol Dysinger from New York University. Would like to ask you about Kashmir and the Durand Line. It seems that in dealing with Pakistan, unless India and Pakistan deal unless Pakistan can be made less paranoid about India, anything we do is going to be difficult. So I'd love to get your observations on the acknowledgement of the Durand Line and on Kashmir. Thank you.
Well, I would just, in response to that, because as you heard me just say, that I think India has to be included in any strategic framework or policy on Afghanistan or Pakistan. I mean, I just simply agree with you. What you have identified specifically, the Durand Line in Kashmir, is at the core of that conflict, aside from the religious and the historical differences, which we're not going to be able to sort that out in one policy. But you know the history of India and Pakistan and all that has played into that. But until you address that definable issue in relationship to that area and specifically those two countries, then you are not going to be able to start to bleed out the paranoia and the bitterness and the hatred and all that now festers in those two societies over this. Now, I don't propose that this is a simple thing to do or an easy thing to do. You are going against immense headwinds here. You're going against hundreds of years of culture. I get that. But we have no ability to change anything until we take on some of these hard choices, and that all has to be on a basis of a common denominator of common interests. Why is it in India's interest to solve some of this? Why is it in Pakistan's interest over on their eastern border to solve some of this so that they can start to equip an army, train an army, based on the relevant realities of what the challenges are in this 21st century? India is not going to invade Pakistan. I don't think. I mean, I was in India twice this year and met with the Prime Minister, met with other leaders. I mean, they made that first thing they said to me. I was with Joe Biden, in fact, on one of those trips when we went. Biden and Kerry and I observed the elections in Pakistan in February. So, just to suffice it to say, I agree with that specific point. That has to be incorporated into the larger mix of a new policy, how we come at this.
Over on this side. Let's go right here. I'll come to you next.
I'm Mike Strauss with Westminster Securities. If China, if there's talk of China maybe slowing down the revaluation of their currency given the recession, what is your position on what the U.S. what position the U.S. should take on that, given our past history of weighing in on that topic?
Well, you all know that we have had some considerable debate in the Congress of the United States on this, and there have been bills introduced, specifically the junior senator or senior senator from New York, Chuck Schumer's bill. I have never believed that you're going to change economies or you're going to change attitudes or you're going to influence the outcome of anything when you publicly bludgeon a country and try to embarrass them, and especially a country like China. I don't know a lot about China. I do know they've been around a little bit. And I know that their frame of reference is 5,000 years. I know ours isn't quite like that. So I think that we're running a pretty risky proposition when we start saying the Congress of the United States is going to dictate to or impose, you are going to devalue your currency to comply with our currency, and so on and so on and so on. Now, there's a smart way to do that. One of the smarter ways, and to answer your question, I think is what Secretary Paulson has started, these strategic economic dialogues with the Chinese. And incidentally, when I was over there, every Chinese leader mentioned that to me, and I met with all of them. I met with the governor of the central bank and the finance ministers, trade ministers, met them all, and foreign ministers and so on. And they all mentioned that. They all mentioned that that was a smarter way to do it. Now, I know they've got their own interests, their perspective. I get that, as we do. But the other thing that we should be smarter about is appreciating the reality of our common interests here. Just as they said to me, what's Obama going to do about the economy, or what's McCain going to do? Well, they're sitting there with $2 trillion in foreign currency reserves. The Asians, as I noted, you all know this, own more than half of our debt. They are invested rather significantly in our treasury bonds and in our country. And biggest of all, we're the biggest market for them. And so I don't think it's in their interest to see our economy go down and our markets to freeze up and nobody can buy any more T-shirts or whatever else that they want to sell us. That's a common interest. And we're smarter if we work in the currency issues with them on a wider variety of common interests, just like religious and political freedoms. We've still got major issues there. Intellectual property rights. They're not complying with some of these WTO standards. They say they are. I do think they're getting better. I do think that they want to try to do it. Franchising rights. That's getting better. I saw Starbucks on every corner. So I know they're drinking some coffee over there. But so we've got a lot of problems. I mean, issues. But I don't think you do it with Schumer-type bills. And I love Chuck Schumer. He's a gentle soul, as you know. And lovable fellow, and he's very smart. But I don't think that's the way you do it. And by the way, Schumer and I have had debates about this in the open in the banking committee.
I think as many people in the room know, he's also very subtle when it comes to fundraising. Question here and then another in the back. Okay.
Member of the Asia Society. My question concerns the proposed Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline. Now, I happen to believe that the only way to bring about stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan is to buy it in a politically acceptable manner with more money than they're getting from the drug cartels. Would you care to comment on this?
To buy the gas from Turkmenistan? Is that what you're saying?
Stability, by stability.
Oh, this is the proposed pipeline.
No, which pipeline? You mean under the Caspian and to the west?
Oh, from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan to...
Oh, the other way. Okay. Yes.
To Pakistan to India.
Yes.
And it's been proposed for many years. The Asian Development Bank was initially meant to promote it. I believe it's being looked at quite hard again recently. But my question is concerned about whether you think that this could bring about stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan, particularly by giving them enough money so it can outspend the drug cartel.
I see. Okay. Sorry, I didn't understand. I'm always in favor of economic development and commercial enterprise and options. And I think in the end that as long as it's transparent up front, I think in the end that enhances all possibilities and peoples and regions and stability and security, if for no other reason. Then it puts more people on high ground with more options. Where we run into trouble in the world, and it's the history of man, is a result of concentrations of power. You look at the pipeline going into Europe from Russia. The Russians control 60 to 70% of the natural gas that goes into Europe. Now that's a concentration of power. And they are using that strategically for their own interests, and they know they are, and we know it. Now, anything that widens those pipelines, north, south, east, west, anything that brings more people into a common interest sharing the benefit of those pipelines, which would, obviously. All those dynamics that go into it, generally, I'm for. Now, the specifics and so on, we might be able to pick it apart. But I think that's always healthy.
Let's take the question from the back. Yes.
Hello, my name is Nusha. I'm a member of the Asia Society. I'm an Iranian-American citizen, and I'm a student. My question is, what is the likelihood of an attack against Iran under the new administration, whether it's Obama or McCain? Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here.
Well, there is a degree of difference on that between the two candidates. I think they've lock and load here, but I think most people are aware that Senators Obama and Senators McCain have a difference of opinion on how to deal with Iran. And I think, and I can't speak for either one of them, and I can't speak for future options, certainly. First, I would hope that whoever the next president is and his new team is not seriously planning an attack on Iran. Now, that's what we know today. I don't know what happens here in the next year or so on. But I don't think it's very likely that would happen. All nations, of course, always have to be in a position to keep all options on the table. We understand that. The presidential candidates know that. And especially great nations like the United States, because people rely on that premise. But also people rely on our good judgment, and that we're not going to do anything unwise that would precipitate another war. Now, we're in 2 wars now, and I'm not sure we want to go into the third. But first of all, I don't know where we'd get the manpower. But I don't think it's very likely that either President McCain or President Obama would, in the near term, attack or plan to attack Iran.
Although one of them would be sorely tempted. Last question in the back over there.
Hi, my name is Gigi Lee, and I'm from the Korean consulate in New York. Earlier, you talked about critical bilateral relationships for the U.S. And in 2000, the Armitage Report made the case for a stronger U.S.-Japan alliance and envisioned Japan as the Great Britain of the East. And I was wondering if you think the next president should maintain this view, and if so, how would that affect regional stability?
Well, Japan is, of course, a critically important partner of the United States and has been since World War II, as everybody knows. And I think that relationship is going to become more and more important because it does represent an anchor in Asia for the United States in that partnership that's very real and very trusted. And Armitage's report, which I read, and I know Armitage very well, he makes some very good points there. But what I've always said, like in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, in our relationship with Israel versus the Arab countries, and I would say this too about any situation, we should never put ourselves, the United States of America, in a position where we've just arbitrarily choosing. Well, is China more important than Japan? Well, in many ways, you look down the road, and anybody can come to their own judgment on this. You could probably technically, structurally say, well, eventually, China is going to be a more important relationship than Japan for the United States. Some would argue the other way. Well, no, not really, and so on. We shouldn't even have that debate. We should never, ever forfeit a relationship with a country based on where we're forced into, for whatever reason, to choose between one of the two, and obviously unless there's something where one country attacks another country, something like that. But we should have relationships with all countries. They're all going to be a little different. I mean, Israel's relationship with the United States, it's always going to be different. I mean, because of Harry Truman's decision, because the United States of America, there's Israel. And we've always had that special relationship. But that should never come, in my opinion, at the expense of our Arab allies or our Arab friends. Japan's relationship is always going to be, I believe, special. It's going to be a different relationship. But that shouldn't come, nor do the Japanese want it to, I believe, at the expense of developing a relationship, closer relationship with China. It's in the interest of Japan that we all have a closer relationship, as it is with Korea. And as a matter of fact, I talked to the leaders of all three of the countries about this very question. And there are times when leaders have to make some choices on different things. I know that. Good example is when I was in China last week, every leader of China asked me about why did you support, why did the Congress support, why did the President, once again, sign off on $6.5 billion worth of armaments for Taiwan. I thought we were kind of getting along, and I thought things were going well, and we were friends and so on. Now you guys do this. Well, you listen and so on. But you take the Chinese leaders back through the Taiwan Strait Act and the Shanghai Communique and where we've been and one China policy and how we've always supported a peaceful resolution and defensive weapons and so on. So you're always going to have these kinds of issues. that have to be addressed and factored in. But I don't necessarily disagree at all with what the Armitage report was about, except with, in my opinion, the caveat that shouldn't necessarily, nor does anyone expect, I don't think, that the Japanese or the Americans or the South Koreans, that it should come at the exclusion, the exclusion of everybody else.
Well, thanks very much,
Joe,
Senator.
thank you.
I expect even after you leave the Senate, we will continue to hear from you.
I'm going to be Holbrook's driver. Richard, thank you.
And thank all of you, and the Senator will be signing his books in the back.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.